Welcome to another episode of the Everyday Investor Podcast, and welcome to post-election here in New Zealand. Now, for those of you who wondered why I didn't interview the politicians this time around like I did last time in the previous election, maybe next year I will. To be honest, half of them didn't return my emails, and well, the other half, I kind of found them rather boring, so I didn't want to bore you with that. So in today's episode, let me frame it like this. Sometimes it's hard to believe that you could be healthy again in the midst of an illness when you're sick. Or sometimes it's hard to feel like you can be successful in the midst of a setback, whether it's work, relationships, or whatever it is. And it's hard to believe in a summer when the last one was just an absolute shocker. But the rest and medication can work. The new job or new deal you've struck is only another phone call away, and the Earth still follows the same orbit around the sun. Day follows night, and it's always the darkest before the dawn. You know the drill. As in many places throughout the world, though, New Zealand's taken a turn over the last few years. Crime has spiked. Education standards have slipped. Access to health care has deteriorated. Mental health, it's nasty. And we're paying far more for a government to do far less than what we actually need. Sure, you don't need to worry about this really, because you could just focus on building wealth in your own household, increase your income, manage your expenses, and invest the rest the best you can. But at some stage, you still need to get outside. And while there's a hot war heating up in the physical realm in a lot of parts of the world, a financial war is being waged against everyday people in their own household. It's poverty that's been advancing over the last few years. And it's advancing not just in the lower income, but in the middle class too. Young families being forced to work harder for less. And yeah, of course, blame the other political party that you don't like. But eventually you're going to realize it's not about left and right, it's about up and down. Unaccountable central banks and increasingly centralized government with little to no oversight rule over a people who don't understand and possibly don't even care how things really work. There's no point in building wealth in your household when the world our politicians rule is falling apart. Thankfully, though, there's a cure in the form of common sense for the incoming new government, a prescription for prosperity. Today, I'm talking with Oliver Hartwich. Oliver is a German economist and executive director of the think tank known as the NZ Initiative. In the show notes is a copy of the report that we're referring to. I'd really encourage you to check it out. It's an easy read. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, please leave a review on Spotify or iTunes if you haven't done so already, and it'll help others find the podcast as well, just like you did. Let's get started. You're listening into the Everyday Investor Podcast. Passive investing, property investment, managed funds, and crypto. If you're an everyday person wanting to build new wealth for the new world that you're heading into, then this podcast is for you. I'm Darcy Ungaro, your host. I'm a qualified financial advisor, but I'm still learning how to invest better and teach others how to do the same. I talk with guests and cover a range of topics designed to get you to think for yourself here. But please keep in mind, this can't be considered financial advice. Be sure to do your own research here and seek qualified advice of your own before making investment decisions. If you want more information, check out the show notes in your podcast player and make sure that you've subscribed to YouTube also. Then follow the Everyday Investor on all social media channels. The NZ Everyday Investor Podcast receives support from the following partners: Easy Crypto, the safe and easy way to buy and sell crypto in New Zealand; Gorilla Technology, increasing business success through innovative and strategic IT solutions; Ungaro & Co. Financial Advice for everyday people building everyday wealth. Hope you enjoy the show. Let's get started. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Everyday Investor. I'm with Oliver Hartwich from the NZ Initiative. How are you, Oliver?
I'm very well. Great to be with you.
Fantastic. Thanks for joining me today. So today we're going to have a conversation around this prescription for prosperity. Great briefing to the incoming government. So the first sort of talking point in section 1 around the fiscal space is no new taxes. Read my lips, no new taxes. And a setup of an oversight system to ensure efficiency in the government system. How has this worked elsewhere, and how could it be implemented in New Zealand in terms of that spirit of no new taxes and let's just be more efficient?
Well, first of all, I think the New Zealand government currently taxes enough already. we don't have a revenue problem in New Zealand, we have a spending problem. We are just not spending all the tax revenue wisely. So rather than introducing new taxes, I think we should actually look into the efficiency of our current spending regimes. The other thing is actually, you're asking about the oversight of our fiscal policy. And of
Yeah.
course, New Zealand had reforms undertaken, well, about 30 years ago under Ruth Richardson. So we have some rules, for example, the pre-election economic and fiscal update that Treasury has to prepare precisely to get more transparency into our public finances. But we think that these rules are no longer sufficient. We need better oversight and we need ongoing oversight when it comes to spending and tax decisions. And I just want to give you my frustration actually with PREFU. We saw that this year. So the government, the Minister of Finance, tells Treasury what the Minister of Finance thinks he will do over the next few years. And Treasury is bound by law to take this in and basically do their modeling according to the minister's assertions. Now, what we've seen in PREFU this year was, of course, that these assertions were wildly optimistic and actually quite unrealistic in parts, but Treasury had absolutely no choice but to take them at face value. We think actually what we need to do is to have something a bit more robust, where we have an independent body, arm's length from government, actually going through the figures and telling us how realistic things are. There are such bodies internationally. In fact, with the setup of one of them, I was actually a little bit involved myself, and that is the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK. So that came out of a very similar frustration that the then Chancellor of the Exchequer in opposition, George Osborne, had. I was involved in a small round of economist meeting with George Osborne, and he had exactly the same complaint about governments fiddling with their numbers until they kind of met all their guidelines. And we advised him at the time, well, then why don't you establish something to look at that, a different kind of council? And out of that came the Office for Budget Responsibility. And I've always wondered whether George Osborne at some stage regretted setting it up, because they were very critical of his policies, and they certainly were critical of Liz Truss. And I think that was one of the factors actually leading to her downfall, the Office for Budget Responsibility pointing out the holes in Liz Truss's plans. But in any case, I think it's good to have such an institution, because it would help us get more realistic forecasts, ensure that the government doesn't actually fiddle with its own fiscal rules, and probably get better value for money. I mean, okay, you might say in an ideal world, we would get that from Treasury, but I think Treasury doesn't do that job anymore, so we probably need something else.
Yeah, and I think in this environment with a cost of living crisis, aka inflation, we're all being forced to tighten our belts in our households and do more with less. Yet, when we look at the problems in New Zealand in particular, we're told that maybe, hey, it's just about more taxes, because look at what a great job we're doing already with the tax revenue we're collecting. But in reality, we don't seem to have a lot of accountability and a lot of power as people, it seems, to bring to light some of the mismanagement, I guess I could suggest, around how they're actually spending our money, because it's not government money, it's our money that we need to remember.
That's exactly right. And I mean, in previous times, of course, we could have probably relied a bit more on the media to do that job for us. But I think the media are quite weak, actually, in New Zealand. Again, going back to PREFU, as soon as the government released the PREFU report, loads of journalists said, well, actually, look at the figures. Everything is fine. Nobody actually did their job at really going through PREFU and asking whether any of this is realistic. So they basically took everything at face value and swallowed the official line, hook, line, and sinker. So if that's the kind of treatment that we're getting from the media, then we, as I said, we need something else. We need something else, another institution, another set of rules to actually deliver the transparency that we need to make better and better informed decisions.
Yes. Let's move on to the next one, which is a recommendation suggesting the abolition of subsidies for KiwiSaver. So presumably this is the member tax credits, $521 a year. Your or NZM Initiative's suggestion here is that we abolish that. The government just stop doing that. Can you go into the logic around that?
Well, basically our argument here is that we haven't seen any evidence that these subsidies have actually increased the amount of savings. So many people claim, of course, that without these subsidies, people simply wouldn't save for retirement. That is just not true. Whenever you look at the national savings rate and you compare it and you ask people about their choices, KiwiSaver actually doesn't do much. The savings that we get in KiwiSaver probably would have occurred anyway, in different ways, of course, through different means. But we are still to see any evidence that KiwiSaver actually lifted or changed the savings culture in New Zealand. So that's roughly a waste of money.
Yeah, no, and I can totally understand that. Like, as a financial advisor that's actually talking to people about taking out KiwiSaver, often it's the people that do have a choice of whether they do it voluntarily or not, specifically the self-employed people that need that motivation to do it. And sometimes that $521 a year is a little bit of an incentive, but I do have to acknowledge the fact that it's probably quite expensive to do that. And in terms of bang for buck, it doesn't actually move the needle much. Like, a lot of people are still rather ambivalent around it, and they're not necessarily motivated to do it when they have a choice to take out KiwiSaver. So it's just still kind of disappointing, because what that effectively does is it potentially sets us up for even more inequality in retirement. For those that did have a choice, or those that don't bring in an income, there would be absolutely no contributions at all apart from investment returns. Don't you see that as a bit of a negative long-term side effect of that?
Well, no, because what you also have to take into account is, of course, that this money doesn't fall from heaven. So for a lot of people, is actually they are paying for their subsidies to KiwiSaver with their own taxes. So I mean, I pay quite a lot of tax actually, and I still get the subsidy every year. So I don't think that really makes much sense. I would rather like to have a tax cut, and I would like to spare us that kind of churn where we actually pay for our own subsidies. And for most
Yeah.
people, I think that's probably the case.
Maybe we could have tax deductible contributions towards KiwiSaver even.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, you have to make a choice really. At what stage do you want to tax income? Do you want to tax it when you pay it into these systems, or do you want to pay tax when you take the money out of them? But in any case, it has to be consistent.
Now, something a little bit more controversial, I think a little bit more controversial, suspending New Zealand superannuation fund contributions. What's the logic behind that suggestion?
Well, I think actually we shouldn't have the super fund in the first place, um, especially not at a time when the government's running massive deficits. So we're making contributions to a savings account while we're still actually borrowing money. It doesn't make sense. And I've never been the greatest fan of sovereign wealth funds. I can understand the logic and the rationale for setting it up at the time, because it was, from my understanding, a way for Michael Cullen as finance minister to kind of curb his colleagues' enthusiasm for spending at the time. So rather than spending all the tax revenue that they had at the time, he rather redirected it to this sovereign wealth fund. But in principle, I think there are much better ways of dealing with public finances than to put it into such a vehicle.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's now move to the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, central banks, during the period around that March 2020 period, where the central bank kind of mirrored the responses that were happening around other countries as well. We embarked on a situation where effectively money was cheap and plentiful for a season. We're now reaping the side effect of that decision, and it's forcing a little bit more attention, I think, and rightly so, on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. And one of the suggestions is to amend the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act to specify a single objective for monetary policy, which is long-term price stability. For context, it's been expanded in the last few years to include all sorts of different things that weren't really its original mandate, and it's growing in size, and it's also a regulator in New Zealand. So if we kind of bring it back into that single objective, what would happen? Would we save money? Would it be less likely that we'd tip into inflation? What's the kind of logic behind that?
Well, it depends on the personality of the governor. That was our argument at the time that the government moved towards a dual mandate for the Reserve Bank. We said actually in practice it might not do that much, because if you are a reasonable Reserve Bank governor, you would know, of course, that as a central bank, you can only really do something for price stability. I mean, you can fiddle a little bit with employment in the very short run, but in the long term, of course, a central bank does not choose the level of employment. And we've known this in economics for at least 40 years. There is no choice to be made between employment and price stability. In the end, you can only really target price stability, and the employment will kind of follow. However, if you have a less qualified governor, a more eccentric governor, that governor might actually fall into the trap of thinking that he might do something with employment. And I think we've seen a bit of that in the last few years. So just to take away the temptation to just fiddle with employment, even in the short run, and thinking that you can actually do more as a central bank governor than your job actually entails, we think we should clarify this, go back to just price stability. And while
Yes.
we're at it, we get back to the price stability target that we used to have, which is between 0 and 2%, rather than 1 to 3%, because we think that's too high. And the other thing is actually we need to get the central bank more generally back on target, which is price stability, and take all the distractions away that it has actually acquired over the last few years. So we have a lot of action now within the central bank on climate change, on the Maori economy, on house prices. And a lot of this activity is just tangential to the RBNZ's core business, which is to keep prices stable and which is to keep the financial system stable. And I don't think that the distractions really helped. And you could actually see this before inflation started to spike in New Zealand. In some annual reports of the Reserve Bank, they mentioned climate change dozens of times and inflation maybe 6 or 7 times. So they took their eyes off the ball and they took their eyes off the target. And I think it is time to correct that and actually bring the Reserve Bank back to where it used to be, which is a stability-focused Reserve Bank, just focused on that.
Do you think that there's like a tendency, like some have questioned, myself included, around the independence between government and central bank? And do you think that maybe it's not so much that they are becoming too close, but that the government is probably just putting more responsibility on the Reserve Bank as a way to contract out the heavy lifting so that they can do more with less? Is there a logic in that?
Well, the central bank and the Minister of Finance will always have some working relationship, but I think it's become a little bit too close. So since we introduced the Monetary Policy Committee, for example, we've had a Treasury observer on that committee. I think that's unhelpful. We've also seen, of course, that the Reserve Bank got heavily involved in financing government activity during COVID. So I think it's worthwhile actually clarifying that these are two different institutions with different purposes. And while they should be talking to each other from time to time, I think that relationship has become a lot too cozy.
Yeah. Oliver, the deposit insurance scheme, I know with what we've seen this year in the United States with the FDIC and how that worked to protect depositors in the US, probably sent a signal to many Kiwis thinking that, hey, why don't we have this here in New Zealand? It was talked about, let's fast track it now. We need this sense of safety. You're in this report suggesting that be scrapped. It should be abolished. We shouldn't do that at all. Talk to me about the moral hazard component around that and just why generally it might not actually be a good idea to go ahead with that.
You already mentioned moral hazard as one of the problems of deposit insurance, because once you have deposit insurance, there will be a temptation to go into riskier types of investment, because you know that in the end, if things go wrong, you will be bailed out. We've seen this time and again, actually, all over the world. Whenever people have the justified assumption that if things go wrong, somebody else will pay, they are willing to go for riskier investments just to get an extra few percentage points of interest, for example. I mean, think of all those European savers who invested their money in Icelandic banks in the early 2000s just because they paid 6 or 7%, when in Britain you could maybe get 4 or 5. The assumption was that if things really go wrong and pear-shaped, there will be someone actually just bailing you out and paying for that. And therefore, you don't have to really pay too much attention to the risk profile of these banks. That's exactly the kind of behavior that we would be getting with deposit insurance in New Zealand too. But there's another thing, actually, a side aspect that we should probably talk about. We just had, of course, a massive exercise in requiring higher degrees of capital for our banks. The idea was, of course, to make them more robust, safer, able to withstand a 1 in 200 year kind of crisis. It was a very costly exercise, if you remember. We were basically requiring our banks to hold about $15 billion more in capital. So while we've done that, and actually we've gone through a crisis now with COVID, and the banks have come out of this crisis, again, very profitable, is there really a need then to introduce deposit insurance on top of that? I mean, it would seem to me that if you really want to do something to protect bank customers and savers, well, you can do it by either making the banks super capital intensive and make them hold enormous amounts of capital just as a buffer,
Mm.
or you have a deposit insurance scheme. Well, in fact, this government seems to want to do both, and I wonder if that's not just at least one scheme too many.
Yeah. Yeah. No, probably. I'm not going to go off reservation too much here, but I really want to stay on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand just a little bit longer. In your view, do you think the decisions that they adopted in March 2020 were justified in light of the fact now that we have inflation, the likes of which we haven't seen for like almost a generation now in terms of the intensity and the duration so far?
Well, let's put it this way. Whatever decisions they took in March 2020, I'm willing to forgive them for that. Because in March 2020, we simply didn't know how this crisis would play out. We were in really uncharted territory at the time. We haven't had a pandemic of that kind in our lifetimes. We didn't know how this would be. However, by I think May or June 2020, we could see actually that this was not a Keynesian style aggregate demand crisis where you just go through the economy and stimulate. This was actually an exogenous supply shock, almost textbook style, because we had massive supply problems, supply chain problems, and the Reserve Bank should have actually recognized that this is a different beast. It's a different type of crisis, which you can't actually solve by stimulating aggregate demand. In fact, stimulating aggregate demand in an exogenous supply shock actually makes the problem worse, because you have a limited amount of supply, and now you're actually increasing the demand side. And guess what that does? Well, it pushes up prices. So I think after the first couple of months, there was enough time really to rethink what we're dealing with. The Reserve Bank should have actually changed tune. Instead, they went further ahead and they kept stimulating the economy to the tune of more than $50 billion. I mean, stopping kind of halfway towards their goal of initially printing $100 billion, of course. But by then it was too late. And the really weird thing was that it was so visible to ordinary economists outside the Reserve Bank what was going on. And the
Yeah.
Reserve Bank kept going ahead regardless. So that's what I would say. I don't blame anyone for anything they did in March or April or even May 2020 because it was such a novel situation. It took us a while to understand what we're dealing with. And I don't exclude myself. But I think from at least May, June 2020, they should have actually realized that what they were doing was totally counterproductive. And by the way, we said so at the time. And we were not the only ones, but the Reserve Bank didn't listen. And now we're paying the price for that.
We are paying the price for that. So now we know where the inflation came from. And the other issue, I guess, is that the large scale asset purchase program. So I'm just going to read a section from the report. The Treasury has estimated losses on the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's large scale asset program, LSAP, cost taxpayers around $10.5 billion. I'm guessing most New Zealanders have no idea that effectively the Reserve Bank went out there and bought an asset which has cost the taxpayer $10.5 billion so far. Do you think that maybe there's some sort of duty of care, at the very least, to educate New Zealanders as to how the Reserve Bank works from the Reserve Bank? Because I don't think that many New Zealanders would be happy about this type of investment that's been done on their behalf if they knew that that was the risk.
Oh, I totally understand where you're coming from. The losses currently per person in New Zealand stand at about $2,000.
Yeah.
That's an enormous amount of money for many people. And you asked whether people are aware of that. I can guarantee you that more than 95% would have never heard of that.
That's
This
right.
is something that we discuss on a daily basis here in the office and that our economist friends in Wellington are all well aware of. But I think the ordinary New Zealander has absolutely no clue. What's happened is, of course, that the Reserve Bank went into the crisis with a massive asset purchase program. They bought this at a time when interest rates were extremely low. We could all expect that at some stage interest rates would have to go up again, as they did. And with every percentage point that these interest rates are going up, the previous investments are effectively losing in value. And that's basically what the Reserve Bank incurs as losses. Before they embarked on this program, they got an indemnity from the Treasury, and that means that the New Zealand taxpayer is recapitalizing the central bank. And this is now happening. As you say, it's currently just above $10 billion. I think it might have even touched 11. And the Reserve Bank is now being paid by the Treasury to the tune of, I don't think I've got the precise figure. I think it's about $150 million a month, basically over many years. So it's basically paying this off as we go. But most people would have no clue. And yeah, this is one of the results of a misguided COVID management policy on the monetary side.
Right.
And it should be a scandal. It's only because the population is not financially literate enough to recognize it as such, and that's why we're not talking about it.
Wow. There's one element in this where I couldn't find the exact place in the report, but I did see it the first time I read it, and that was about GST. So the idea here, and this is now onto a different section of the report, the idea is that if there is GST raised in one region, so if there's a whole bunch of economic activity which generates a lot of GST, then there should be some revenue sharing, I guess, from the centralized government to the decentralized government, more the council layer level. Is that kind of the idea that you're suggesting? And if I've nailed that, can you just describe it a little bit better than I have there, how that would work?
This is an idea actually that we first proposed in 2013, and I can give you the idea in a nutshell and the background to the idea in a nutshell. So imagine you're Auckland Council, and it comes to development, and you're told that over the next 20 years, Auckland is growing by whatever, 200 or 300,000 people, and that means Auckland needs to build houses. Well, what's the calculus from Auckland City Council's perspective? It means that Auckland City Council would have to invest a lot in roads, in infrastructure, that water care would have to lay the pipes, that you probably need to have more parks and playgrounds, that you have to upgrade the libraries, that you have to do all sorts of things that are really expensive, because growth is expensive for a council. Now, what happens then when that growth has happened? Well, the newly built houses, of course, would generate some GST revenue. They would also then generate more income taxes, partly from the building activity, but also the extra residents that will live there eventually will pay income taxes. There will be corporate taxes. All the builders that build stuff, of course, they will also pay taxes on all the activity that they generated in the economic activity. And what is the final result? The final result is that the GST, the income tax, the corporate tax, they go to Wellington. But the costs to make that development happen, they stick with Auckland Council. And so you've got this massive discrepancy in New Zealand for any kind of development where the local tier typically pays to make it happen and where central government in Wellington gets all the upsides from it. And then we're surprised that city councils are never that fond of development and that nothing really gets built in a hurry. And that local government is often not very business friendly and not very development friendly. It's not just housing, by the way. It's business activity and business development. I mean, you probably remember last year we had the case in Waikato that Sleepyhead wanted to build a new bedding factory. They actually didn't want to just build a factory. They wanted to build a whole suburb around it for their workers. Waikato Council, they were not that interested because they had exactly that calculus. Why should we pay for all the infrastructure? Why should we actually deal with all the NIMBYs in the neighborhood who don't like it? When in the end, we don't really gain much from that and Wellington gets all the taxes. So here comes our idea. We have to give local government a bit more of an incentive. And by the way, we also have to compensate them for the infrastructure investment they have to undertake. And our idea is a very simple one. We proposed in 2013 to just measure how much GST is paid in building activities, because that's relatively easy to calculate. So you build a new house and you know exactly how much GST actually this cost in the end. Then we earmark the GST revenue from that and pass it on to local government, partly to pay for the infrastructure, but also to have a better argument with the existing population that here's something for us and actually something for you. We can actually finance our activities better out of that. The advantage would be, first of all, it would keep the GST system clean. This is not like a GST of fruit and veg. It's just measuring the revenue as a kind of a quick tool to channel some money back to councils to where taxes are generated. And it would provide incentives for development. And since we proposed the idea in 2013, the ACT Party actually tabled in this current parliament, still current parliament, a private members bill suggesting precisely that. So it's part of the ACT program. The National Party has also looked into that and they are sympathetic. They would like to do this in a more complicated way, but in principle, they understand that we have to pay councils a bit more for these incentives. And so we think this is actually one of the crucial ways in which we have to reform New Zealand's public finance system, because at the moment it's very skewed towards the center. And if we want to have better reasons for councils to go for growth, then we have to pay them for that.
And it's kind of like that. This one of the general themes in this entire report this prescription for prosperity is more decentralization versus centralization. And I can understand the concept quite well, I guess, with what you just said, because in one case we have local government who's faced with the cost, central government who gets the revenue, and very little oversight and accountability around how that's distributed. Of course, there's going to be, it's like any household, right? There's one person who's making the money and they're really, really careful in how it's spent. And then there's another party who's just spending willy-nilly with zero accountability. Of course, there's going to be some tension there. And ultimately, the whole house falls down after a while. So this kind of is I guess, a little bit of an insight as to probably why we're having even some of these spin-off problems, like we can't get enough houses built at the right cost because all these extra cost development contributions go up. And of course, there's red tape, because why would you want to spend money? So I get it, right? But do you think that, again, everyday New Zealanders probably don't appreciate this dynamic and understand it to the point where they might have not even factored that into their voting?
Yeah, that is a problem. The additional problem on top of all of that is, of course, that councils do not have the best reputation in New Zealand. So when you talk to people and try to explain that you would like to give councils a bit more power and money, they typically respond, "Are you crazy? Have you ever talked to a mayor or a council? And you want to give these people more power and money?" And I get it, because I live in Wellington. So if you look at Wellington City Council, it is fairly obvious that this is not the most competent organization. And yet, I would still say it is probably the way it is because it doesn't have the right incentives. Wellington City Council is not paid for performance. Wellington City Council gets paid regardless. I mean, I'm lucky enough to own a home in Wellington. And if I decided that because Wellington City Council really doesn't perform well, I'm moving away. I'm taking my money and I buy a house in the Hut instead, or in Porirua, or in Masterton, or wherever, just to punish Wellington City Council and move away. Well, I wouldn't punish Wellington City Council because somebody else would buy my house and pay the rate that I would have paid. So they can perform as poorly as they like. They will still get the same rates revenue. And again, this is something we have to change. We have to make sure that councils get punished when people flee because they don't like the services that the council provides. It doesn't happen in New Zealand, but it happens in other countries. In Switzerland, for example, you have local income taxes, you have cantonal income taxes, and then you've got a small federal income tax. So the result would be, if I don't like what my Swiss council does, or my Swiss canton, and I just move 10 kilometers down the road because it's really that small scale in Switzerland, then somebody else would get my taxes. And therefore, there is a lot more competition between neighboring councils and neighboring cantons in Switzerland because they all want your taxes and they treat you better. Believe it or not, if you live in Switzerland, the council treats you like a customer. In New Zealand, typically, they treat you like your nuisance.
That's unfortunate. And it kind of just makes a mockery of even the term public servant, because it kind of feels like we, the public, are the servant rather than those in public service. So, Oliver, we have to finish up our conversation, unfortunately, because you have to go. But this is the document here, the Prescription for Prosperity. I've taken a couple of doses already. I immediately feel better, way more prosperous. I do hope and pray that our nation kind of figures this out. So I'll include a link in the show notes to those that want to download a copy of that, and encourage listeners to check out the NZ Initiative podcast as well. Thanks very much for your time, Oliver.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
All right. Thanks for listening into the Everyday Investor Podcast. Like what you've heard, but you want more? Make sure that you've subscribed to our YouTube channel and subscribe to the Everyday Investor newsletter too. The links for everything are found in the show notes that you can access easily by swiping or tapping over the cover art in your podcast player. If you received value in some way, I'd love it if you could take the time to write a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Share it with a friend, or think of our show partners where appropriate. Easy Crypto, the safe and easy way to buy and sell crypto in New Zealand. Gorilla Technology, increasing business success through innovative and strategic IT solutions. And Ungaro & Co. Financial advice for everyday people building everyday wealth. Remember, some investments or strategies discussed on these episodes may result in financial loss. Be sure to do your own research and ideally seek qualified advice of your own before making investment decisions. Hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we'll catch you next time around.